Hello. Back in the 1970s, when people were free, when people could grow their hair long, have big moustaches and be happy, when the people's radio was free and everyone could listen to wonderful music by Brotherhood of Man, Peters and Lee and Shawaddy Waddy, when people could watch Pan's people celebrating their womanhood on television. That time, the 1970s, has nothing whatsoever to do with our story. Well, almost nothing. You see, our story is about a man called Carl who fell asleep in that decade. He fell asleep halfway through 1972, but didn't wake up. Amazingly, he didn't actually wake up until March 2009. Let me explain. On August the 4th, 1972, Carl was working in his laboratory. He was charting the path of a meteorite and had just worked out that it would miss planet Earth by a mere 72,000 miles, a hair's breadth in cosmic terms, the equivalent, if you like, to a bullet travelling through the sleeve of your jumper, a meteorite which could have wiped out our civilization. And after he had made this fantastic and chilling discovery, Carl popped out to buy a sandwich. And while crossing the road outside his laboratory, Carl got hit by a car. Before I continue telling you about Carl, it's important to mention something about us and our time together. Because time is very, very, very complicated. You see, if the future hasn't happened yet, and everything that has happened in the past doesn't exist anymore, then there is only the present. And if there is only the present, then time doesn't actually exist, does it? Not actually. It's just a notion that some philosopher people came up with. And now, here we are, trying to measure on our fantastically expensive watches something which doesn't actually exist. But you don't have to worry about the concept of time, because I am right next to you now, in the present. I mean, right now, right up next to you, with only the double positive repelling action of our little electrons preventing me from slipping into you. I mean, right into you. My atoms mixing with your atoms, baby. Me inside you, and you inside me, and nothing making any sense whatsoever. So, Monique. I'm going to call you Monique, even though we both clearly know that that's not your name. It's just to protect ourselves, because there's a strong possibility that there might be people from the Physics Society listening. So, Monique, I want to tell you now how Carl fits into all this. Carl, our hero, yes? Carl, who, as you know, has been asleep for 37.5 years. On March the 30th, 2009, a nurse called Kate was straightening Carl's bedsheets when he suddenly sat up and said, "I'll do that." After 37.5 years of calm dormancy, after 328,500 hours of serene rest, something clicked on, reconnected, lit up, blinked to life like a little big bang, totally awake. Carl was now ready to pick up where he left off. Nurse Kate was in such shock that she simply stood there, aghast, her right hand poised beneath the mattress, halfway through a hospital corner. 7 years she'd known Carl, 7 years of chatting to him about anything and everything which came into her head, and getting no more response from him than she got from the gladioli in her front garden. Less, in fact. And now, suddenly, here he was, offering to make his own bed. The only offer of help he'd made in nearly 4 decades. Next, Carl tried to get out of bed, something he hadn't attempted for 13,688 days. It was only when he started to fall towards the floor that Nurse Kate leapt out of her own brief paralysis and sprang forward to help him. In their tangled embrace, she felt Carl's hand close in on her breast. She staggered backwards with the weight of his embrace. 2 steps, 1, 2, she and Carl breathed in simultaneously. It was at that moment that Carl's wife, Sally, walked in. "Hello, love," said Carl over Nurse Kate's shoulder. Sally tried to speak, but instead she gave up and fainted. "Doctor!" called Nurse Kate. "Sorry about this," said Carl, "but have you got any idea what's going on?" Kate needed all her strength to lever Carl back onto the bed. As the bed took over his weight, she felt his body brace into a sitting position. She breathed out and met his eyes. They were sparkling with life. Kate felt like she was staring into the very eyes of existence. It was a moment of life-affirming clarity. You've woken up," she managed to say. "I never thought that you've woken up." Carl swallowed, and the smallest tremors of confusion began to leak into his face now. A naive sort of confusion, like a baby's searching vulnerability when it plunges headlong into the cold light of birth. Like its look of stupefaction in the pregnant pause following a seismic push from one world into another. Like the liminal moment before its unrehearsed voice splits through the first molecules of drawn breath. The moment before its lost expression crumples like tracing paper for tears to roam its crinkles. Maybe he was alarmed because Kate was crying. Kate's face was now gulping in a smile which gasped with joy. And then suddenly Kate remembered Sally, Carl's wife, lying on the floor as if emptied out of a jar of shock which had been sealed shut for 37.5 years and labelled "Open slowly and with extreme caution." "Don't move," Nurse Kate said to Carl. "Do you need to lie down?" "No," said Carl. It was so strange for Kate to hear his voice. It was nothing like she'd imagined. Kate punched the red panic button on the wall beside the bed and knelt down beside Sally. She tried to occupy the space equally between the husband and wife, like a conductor poised between the soloist and the first violins. "Sally," said Kate, taking Sally's hand, "Sally, can you hear me?" By collapsing onto the ground, Sally's head and heart had attained the same gravitational level, so her heart didn't need to work as hard to push blood up into her brain. Isn't the body the most beautifully functioning organism? We can but stand in awe of our naturally occurring talents and the freakish culmination of evolutionary events, which distinguishes us clearly from another existence, spent simply licking bacteria off cave walls. 2 doctors burst into the room. One of them was Julio. Whenever Kate saw Julio, her heart soared. He was the man who she wanted to pin her against a wall, drag her skirt up, clutch the back of her head and enter her atomic structure, and then, afterwards, to propose, marry her into his life, and take her and their children to live on a grape farm in Seville. Oh, yes, yes. Sally, Carl's wife, opened her eyes. She was dazed and confused, circling like a drunk zeppelin which had lost all sense of why it was flying or where it was going. "Holy Mary," said Julio on seeing Carl. "Mr. Constantinople!" exclaimed Dylan, the other doctor, who was fairly settled in his home life, apart from a dispute he was having with the family from 4 doors down, whose dog kept shitting all over his front lawn. "It's okay, Sally, you fainted," Nurse Kate said to Sally. Sally looked up. She looked at Carl. The 2 doctors were looking at Carl. Everyone was now looking at Carl, who was sat on the edge of the bed, looking like a child. At precisely that moment, 7.3 miles away, a man called Dennis was driving a taxi. Dennis was 5'9" tall, 57 years old, and he had a face like a kind potato. He was slightly overweight, had a slight Cockney twang, and he always wore a baseball cap, backwards. You could say Dennis was a bit jumpy, a bit nervy, a slight hint of confusion in his eyes, and he often didn't know what to do with his hands. Know what I mean? And people were forever ignoring Dennis. But over the years, he'd grown accustomed to it. He'd grown used to never getting served at the bar, never having a door held open for him, never ever being invited to anything particularly exciting, and people were always forgetting to send him a birthday card. A large proportion of Dennis's time was spent driving around the city in his cab, but he loved his job. He loved the way the city moved. He loved its indifference. He often thought about the tiny significance each of its inhabitants had, the way their lives, on an individual level, affected things in such infinitesimal ways. But, en masse, they formed this huge living and breathing organism. An organism answerable only to itself, searching for direction, unable to successfully connect with its environment, unable to come to terms with its position in the natural world. Dennis was a man who listened to people talking about themselves. The man he had in his car tonight was telling him all about bathroom fittings. However, on this occasion, Dennis wasn't actually listening that closely, because for the past 11 minutes, he had been feeling rather odd, slightly different, slightly light-headed, and his heart was racing. He felt like he might cry. And then his phone rang. Sorry, just one moment, Dennis said to his passenger. Hello, Sally, Dennis said to his sister-in-law. 10 seconds later, Dennis nearly crashed into the car in front. Hey, watch out! Cried the passenger. But Dennis wasn't listening to him. He pulled over. Sally's words were ringing in his ears. He just sat up, Sally said. Carl has woken up. I can't believe it. Carl has woken up. Now, Dennis and Carl had been almost inseparable, like many identical twins. When Carl had fallen asleep in 1972, something in Dennis had also fallen asleep. And now he had woken up. Dennis got out of the taxi and started walking. And then he broke into a run. And another meteorite flew by and missed the Earth. Just. It also went completely unnoticed. Good night.